The non-left was a lot better prepared in propaganda terms for the Wuhan flu panic than it was back in 2008 or in other situations of mass panic. Now that's a good thing. However, the non-left also needs to keep the eyes on the prize instead of wasting time on useless nonsense. Just like with all previous panics in history, the end is always the same. Politics always wins. The question is, which politics? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so we'll tackle the Wuhan flu strictly from the political perspective because realistically this is not a health issue. It's a panic issue and a politically exploitable issue. This should not be controversial to anyone, though of course there is always an endless supply of naive fools out there. So first I'll explain some concepts, then show you how the left is seeding this, and then finally give some advice arisen from the experience we at Freedom Alternative Network already gathered in the first stages of this narrative dispute. Now, I said in the opening that politics always wins. What I mean by that is that absolutely every single event in history that resulted in mass panic ended up being shaped by the political narratives that won the propaganda war during the event itself. The truth matters, but it's not the only aspect that matters, not even by a long shot. If truth were the only thing that mattered, then today we would have applied the wisdom gained during the previous pandemic Chinese virus, namely the Spanish flu. Then we did learn that treating people outside and allowing sunlight to help with the treatment led to a lot fewer deaths. Links, of course, in the low bar, with the full story as studied by those interested in the truth rather than the politics. Now we don't do that, because that narrative, although factually true, lost the narrative war because the politics of medicine had a different interest. The interest being for doctors to get a lot more shekels, initially from the army, then from the state in general, and eventually through direct theft from the populace overall. The same is true with other panics. There are exactly zero doubts that the so-called Great Depression would have ended a lot sooner, and was in fact on its way to ending, and FDR prolonged it in order to get his politics shoved down the throat of the populace. But this is not what you get taught in schools, well, with a few exceptions. Why? Because politics always wins. It doesn't matter who is right, it matters who wins the politics. This is not always true in warfare, admittedly, but that's because the level of disruption in is different in warfare than the level of disruption in other events. Also, the panic is not as generalized during wartime. So the rule that politics always wins only applies in full to mass panic events, whether they are triggered by an economic event, a particular discovery, a particular piece of news, or in the case of the Chinese virus, a perceived medical emergency. The cause is not important. In fact, it doesn't even matter whether the cause has any basis in reality. If there is a mass panic, politics always wins. Here's another example. The sex offender panic, and specifically the panic of over being a pedophile behind every bush in multiple areas of the United States and then later on exported to other countries as well. A stripped down version of that story is depicted in the HBO piece called Indictment, the McMartin trial, which you should watch, by the way. You'll see a lot of similarities to present day. There were multiple such panics, and almost all of them ended up with even stranger and weirder laws that took decades to question and overturn. Why? Because politics won, that's why. It didn't matter that innocent people suffered under wrong-headed laws and politics and practices and policies, yes. The political argument that it's okay to crush people who did absolutely nothing wrong as long as you can excuse it, that it's for the safety of the children, always won the day. Well, almost always. So the first victims of the panic did find some justice after a decade of fighting. I'm talking here about the sex offender panic. But nobody counted, and still nobody counts today, the number of victims that followed the initial panic, who also got seriously crushed under wrong-headed policies. Well, something very similar is happening now too, except the outcome doesn't have to be the same, because the politics have not yet been decided. Don't be fooled. Many of you all will be seeded and primed with the message that the debate is over. No, it's not. No, it's not. The politics of the Wuhan flu panic has not been decided yet. Now, when I say something similar is happening now, I'm of course referring to the entirely emotional argument that it's better to plunge the planet into depression than to leave the economy alone and move resources around to address the temporary medical issue, which, by the way, is nowhere near as serious as people think it is. Because let's be clear, even a mild economic recession like the one in 2008 creates millions of early deaths. The one created now, completely artificial and due to panic, will for sure create a lot more victims than it would have happened if the Wuhan flu would have been left to run its course and its victims treated. But that's a highly unpopular argument now, of course, because people are not driven by reason, but by emotions, which is why the China virus panic is a politically exploitable issue. Now, the thing is that the truth will only come out in 2025 at best. For instance, the impact of the 2008-2009 recession on global health was assessed 6 or 7 years after the end of it. So don't expect data and thorough analysis on this anytime sooner than 2025. However, problem is that the politics doesn't wait that long. The politics of the Kung flu will be decided in the next 12 months at the most, if not even earlier. In most countries, it will be a done deal by October. How do I know that? Because that's what happened every single time. In times of panic, the velocity of propaganda as well as the efficiency of it increases significantly. This is what happened in 2008, it's what happened in 1990, in 1979, in 1929, and in many other events, global, local, or continental, that were induced by panic. 2008 is a good comparison because 2008 is roughly in the same era. The internet wasn't that developed, but was developed enough and resembled quite a lot with the one we use today. From what I observe now, the velocity of propaganda today is about twice the one observed in 2008. If you remember, I did explain in other videos that in the current era, arguments that used to take centuries can now be won or lost in 20 years, and oftentimes even faster than that. This is not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. And sometimes it's faster than 20 years, either because the topic is more straightforward or because you push it during a panic. And this is why not striving to exploit the Wuhan flu panic politically is a mistake. As I said in the intro, the non-left did a much better job at leaping at the opportunity given than it did in previous instances when opportunities arose. But don't be naive, the left had a plan too. Admittedly, this time around their plan turned out to be slightly weaker. This time around, in the first round of the dispute, the rule that everyone has a plan until they get a punch in the teeth applied to them. However, that doesn't mean much, because the narrative dispute will be harsh, and actually it already is harsh, and the non-left will have to not just keep up with the rhythm, as they say in football, but also continue to dictate the terms. In addition, it needs to be said this. In addition to all sorts of weirdos converted into epidemiologists overnight who rush to make all sorts of graphics, 100% of them ending up being entirely wrong, by the way, there are also some successes for the left. Not great successes, and I'm sure frustration is mounting on their side because they're accustomed to win in these kinds of moments, but still not negligible. For instance, for my American friends, how do you like the de facto suspension of the Constitution? Well, in reality, your Constitution is not suspended. And the stay-at-home orders of your stupid governors are illegal. All of them. The courts also agree. Recently, a governor being BTFO'd for trying to cancel the local elections, for instance. But few people know that. Why? Well, it's because of a tiny but highly effective Democrat-funded organization appeared out of nowhere called COVID Act Now, which exists for the sole purpose of eroding your freedom and using the Wuhan flu as a cute pretext. I'll leave a link in the low bar with a thorough description of their disinformation campaign, which persuaded a lot of politicians who are simply not accustomed to that kind of technique. And they're not accustomed because they're boomers, basically. I spotted it right from the get-go because I recognized the template. Heck, I play by the same rulebook. But while that particular disinformation campaign will not last long, in fact, I think by the time I'm taping this, it's probably gone already, others will be more resilient. Why? Because if enough people believe something, even if it's wrong, then that something partially becomes real by virtue of people acting upon that belief. Thus, the consequences created by that belief become real. So, for instance, if enough people believe and act upon the belief that the stock market will crash, even if there is no reason to believe that, those people will end up crashing the stock market. Same in the current mass panic. If enough people believe they will die because of the Wuhan flu, then some of them will. And a lot of them will drive themselves insane, and that in itself determines a lot of externalities. It doesn't matter what I believe about it or what you believe about it, or even if it's true or not. In the case of the Wuhan flu, if you're under the age of 60, you weigh less than 100 kilograms and don't have chronic heart or kidney disease, it is entirely unreasonable to give more than 1 second of thought to the issue that you might die. But that's irrelevant when you're propagandized with disinformation and scary graphs. And that's the part where the left moved much better than the non-left. And I say the left because I include the China Health Organization in that. I mean, heck, their chief is a violent communist wanted for crimes against humanity in his home country and an asset of the CCP. So you can't get more the left than that. But even before that, The Atlantic, which is the home of the most experienced propagandists of the far left, was already publishing last month its initial seeding on how they wish to exploit the Wuhan flu panic. And it's top-tier propaganda too. Their article called "How Will Coronavirus End?" is one of the best pieces of disinformation I read this year. Still easy to spot for experienced agitators, and you will say that normies don't read The Atlantic, so why do I care? Well, first of all, they do. But more importantly, the point of such pieces is not to convince the normies, just like the point of my videos is not to convince the normies necessarily. The point of such pieces is to give a roadmap to their networks of activists. Let me read you a small portion of the article buried somewhere at the end of the article. Scroll down. Yeah, at the end of the article where only those interested read. Quote, "Aspects of America's identity may need rethinking after COVID-19. Many of the country's values have seemed to work against it during the pandemic. Its individualism, exceptionalism, and tendency to equate doing whatever you want with an act of resistance meant that when it came time to save lives and stay indoors, some people flocked to bars and clubs. Having internalized years of anti-terrorism messaging following 9/11, Americans resolved to not live in fear. But SARS-CoV-2 has no interest in their terror, only their cells. Years of isolationist rhetoric had consequences too. Citizens who saw China as a distant, different place where bats are edible and authoritarianism is acceptable failed to consider that they would be next or that they wouldn't be ready. China's response to this crisis had its own problems, but that's for another time. People believed the rhetoric that containment would work, said Wendy Parnett, who studies law and public health at Northeastern University. We keep them out and we'll be okay. When you have a body politic that buys into these ideas of isolationism and ethno-nationalism, you are especially vulnerable when a pandemic hits, unquote. Well, is any of that true? No, not really. But the point is not to convince, but to give a roadmap. Expect to see these points being made 3 to 5 months from now. You won't see them at CNN, at least not at first, but you will for sure see them made by community organizers and narcissistic pricks who promote totalitarian socialism in the name of compassion. Bolshevik Sanders may have dropped out, but those ideas never die. They can only be contained, because entropy is on their side. Well, kinda like the Wuhan flu, really. Except you have more chances to stay alive with the Chinese virus than with communism. And while Bernie-style leftism suddenly fell out of fashion, something which even leftist seeders know all too well, a bit of sanitary communism is still good enough from their perspective. And to their credit, they admit as much. That's why I keep an eye on the Atlantic, because it's one of those places where leftists are fully honest about their intentions. Here, let me read it to you. Quote, "The lessons that America draws from this experience are hard to predict, especially at a time when online algorithms and partisan broadcasters only serves news that aligns with their audience's preconceptions. Such dynamics will be pivotal in the coming months," says Ilan Gondlenberg, foreign policy expert at the Center for New American Security. The transitions after World War II or 9/11 were not about a bunch of few ideas, he says. The ideas are out there, but the debates will be more acute over the next few months because of the fluidity of the moment and willingness of the American public to accept big, massive changes. One could easily conceive of a world in which most of the nation believes that America defeated COVID-19. Despite his many lapses, Trump's approval rating has surged. Imagine that he succeeds in diverting blame for the crisis to China, casting it as a villain and America as the resilient hero. During the second term of his presidency, the US turns further inward and pulls out of NATO and other international alliances, builds actual and figurative walls, and disinvests in other nations. As Gen Z grows up, foreign plagues replace communists and terrorists as the new generational threat. One could also envisage a future in which America learns a different lesson. A communal spirit, ironically born through social distancing, causes people to turn outward to neighbors, both foreign and domestic. The election of November 2020 becomes a repudiation of America First politics. The nation pivots, as it did after World War II, from isolationism to international cooperation, buoyed by steady investments and an influx of the brightest minds. The healthcare workforce surges. Gen Z kids write schools essays about growing up to be epidemiologists. Public health becomes the centerpiece of foreign policy. The US leads a new global partnership focused on solving challenges like pandemics and climate change. In 2030, SARS-CoV-3 emerges from nowhere and is brought to a heel within a month. Close quote. So yeah, this is what the left is priming. Demonize free speech for sanitary and health reasons. Demonize the nation state because it's hindering Chinese health workers. Now, sure, it sounds stupid, but then again, the left and borders have never been really friends. Push for more totalitarian schools for health reasons. You get the point. Nothing changes. Because while the non-left is called conservative, the left is a lot more static. They rarely change their mind, and only if they are forced to. This is where the battle will be happening. Not at the China Health Organization. I mean, at the current rate, that place may not even exist by the end of this mess. I mean, I doubt Winnie the Flu or even Bill Gates will still be willing to fund that thing 18 or 24 months from now. And the reason I'm saying this is because that's exactly how I've been playing every time I wanted to win a narrative. Raised up a huge boogeyman to keep the organized opposition busy, while in the meantime pushing what I really wanted. Don't take the bait. Now, sadly, I see too many on the non-left taking the bait. A lot of energy spent, for instance, on contradictory or even insane statements from the WHO officials. Guys, we already won that. The WHO is toast. Funding is drying up already. Also, there is intentional bait thrown by the opposition via subversion. Again, something that I do to the left all the time. For instance, the claim that the virus doesn't exist and is attributed to the right. Well, nobody on the right ever claimed that, but if you put enough infiltrated drones and get the right screen caps, then you can spread that narrative easily. And the media working for you will believe it, well, at least for a while. Now, sure, such efforts are hindered by the fact that Mr. Trump is president, and much to my surprise, he kept his speculations to a minimum and was right on most of those. But it still works. It's a technique that still works. And of course, on top of that, you have the useful idiots. This time around are the legit conspiracists. Now, see my older video, The Conspiracist Mind, to understand what I mean. Those people aren't evil or leftists, they have a different issue, and this time around they are useful for various left-wing or globalist narratives meant for discrediting. Again, nothing special. This happens in every single narrative dispute. It's how politics is being played. It's baked into the cake, as Americans would put it. Now, okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Well, because the result is not decided, and will not be decided tomorrow or in the next month, but more like in the next 6 months or so. And just like the leftists at the Atlantic admit up front, and that's the only part where they're not lying, that the result is impossible to predict now. What you can do is to work towards the result you want and then make the assessment at the end of the process. We will win some of the narratives, for sure. If I were to speculate, we'll probably win on borders, the European Union, homeschooling, and hopefully, and this one will be the hardest fought, national capitalism. We will probably lose on mental health because the non-left still doesn't take mental health seriously, and we'll probably lose, at least temporarily, on certain events because sanitary communism is inherently privileged in the narrative dispute over, let's say, concerts or football matches. However, there are also issues where nobody can speculate on. For instance, the left is already making a huge anti-privacy push. They know they are on an uphill battle, but they would be stupid not to at least try. The non-left should also make a harder push against the transgenderist nonsense. It's never been easier to outright abolish the whole thing altogether from the legislation. And congratulations to the US states that already did that, by the way, Hungary too, winning. More of the rest of us should push for that too. Sure, it's an uphill battle, but we would be stupid not to try. In Europe, as a result of the rising chaos, and that will happen, mark my words, we should push harder than ever for Second Amendment style of legislation. In times of high crime, public opinion for personal defense can shift quite rapidly. I still regret to this day that I wasn't old and smart enough in 1996. If I could teleport now to 96, my country would have had a Second Amendment. So the point is that there are narratives to win, rights to protect, rights to secure and or expand, and evils to stamp out. The time for propaganda is now, not after this mess. Luckily, many on the non-left understood this instinctively, much to my joy, but many are still reluctant. This is always the problem with many conservatives, really. They think that it's not nice to exploit a crisis politically. Well, that's why conservatives lost so many times, because they were willing to let a good crisis go to waste. Now, hopefully, this time will be smarter. So, what to do? Well, here's some advice. Number one, consolidate and expand wherever possible. This is the best time since the turn of the century to recruit business owners into funding propaganda. Why? Because this time the stupidly insane measures of the politicians harmed their bottom line for absolutely no reason. A lot of people get woke on the huge government question these days, but small businessmen have an almost 100% conversion rate to taxation is theft these days. Go and talk to them. You'd be surprised how much openness you will find. Much more than you would have found merely 2 or 3 months ago. The left has some big corporations on its side, but all capitalist countries are basically 90% small and medium enterprises, and most SMEs are not political, especially in Europe. That's a huge chunk of the market that the non-left has been reluctant to approach. Don't be afraid. Just do it. You will need funding for this, and unless you're someone really known already, you won't be able to fundraise the amount you need. Or if you will be able, it may take a lot longer than you need, and the crisis goes away, and there you go, you let another good crisis go to waste. Number two, keep an eye on the longer term. While you expand, make sure you identify financial opportunities. For instance, I'm seriously considering getting a separate space just for this channel. I couldn't afford it 3 months ago. Now, it's already gotten easier. By December, it will likely get even easier. Not trying to take advantage, or at least consider taking advantage, would make me a fool. But it's not just financials. With almost everyone in the house, as in indoors, finding them online for a quick chat is the easiest in history. And for about a month, it will be the easiest in your lifetime, for sure. Now is the time for networking. Number three, somewhat related, speed up recruiting. Again, with almost everyone indoors for a few weeks, recruiting is at least marginally easier than it was 2 months ago. Expand your network, or create it if you were considering that, or join mine. The point is that not using this for organizing purposes would be a mistake, especially given that the quarantine is having a negative mental health impact on left-wing activists, so their recruiting efforts are halted. Not entirely, but severely diminished. They know that too. That's why they publish those alarmist articles claiming that the lockdown will increase racism or something like that. What they mean is that individualists, who are usually pretty introvert, will network and likely organize easier, to the explicit detriment of leftists. And well, they're not wrong. Number four, make blacklists. This cannot be stressed enough. A situation of crisis puts a lot of people under stress, and the only permissible frustration valve is social media, or the internet in general. This may not be the perfect storm, because perfect doesn't exist, but it's the best opportunity you will get to learning a few details about the true character of certain people. Trigger warning, you will have a lot of surprises. People you thought to be reliable turn out to be utter pussies. People you don't really consider turn out to be very resilient. And people you thought pretty bad of them turn out to be much better than you initially thought. Observe this realignment, draw the necessary lessons, and be ready to apply the necessary policies based on those observations. And blacklists are part of that, an integral part, an essential part of that, because number five, prepare the attack. Panic cards, and especially those who intentionally spread panic card disinformation and refuse to budge under the pressure of reason, those are people who must be punished, whether they're politicians or regular people. My blacklist already has about 2,000 names in it. I will, for sure, practice social distancing from those people. Just when they will think I have forgotten about their evil, just when they will need my help the most, or perhaps when they will seek employment in a place where I have something to say, or perhaps they will seek membership in a civic organization which I can influence, that's when my social distancing will hit. Sounds terrible? Well, so what? This is what the left always does, and it works. What do you think I mean when I say build institutions? I want a non-left version of Media Matters, a non-left SPLC, a non-left fact-checking app, an explicitly anti-socialist parliamentary committee, all with the purpose of enforcing the blacklist. You should do the same at your level, in your community. Now, of course, I don't mean isolate everyone who panicked and got duped by panic card narratives. What I mean is isolate and actively sabotage those who intentionally spread panic and who knew better but chose not to care, or even worse, were paid not to care. And I guess that's all I'm allowed to say on YouTube in English. I'll gladly give you more lessons on what to do with the blacklists in private. And finally, number 6, document everything, especially compromat material. This is crucial, and the non-left is still lagging behind on that, sadly. That's why I hope I will get the financial instruments necessary to expand the infrastructure of Freedom Alternative in order to contribute to the effort of documenting. It's a monumental task, I know. But if those watching this and engaging in our community would get into the habit of saving links, PDFs, and archive links, our glossary could quadruple in the next 2 weeks. And that's just at our tiny level. If half of all non-leftists get into this habit, we could crowdsource a glossary of compromat within months. What is compromat? Well, it's a KGB slang, short for kompromittiruющий материал, which literally means compromising material. What constitutes compromat in this context? Well, anything panic cards say, really. You don't know, in an active crisis, who is right and who is wrong, so you document everything and then sort it out afterwards. Anything the World Health Organization said in the last 5 months is basically compromat. But pay special attention to the paid shills. You will see a lot of them on social media in every country. And if you look for their specific words in different languages, you will find almost the same text in other countries too. Here's a clue. Those promoting the BCG vaccine as a miracle solution for Wu flu, almost all of those are paid shills in Europe. You don't know why yet, but the BCG talking point is, scientifically speaking, pure speculation. The likelihood of it being utterly wrong is pretty high, so document all those shills. You'll thank me later. Again, the same thing happened in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic. By 2010, they were all shilling for some dubious vaccines which had serious issues. Of course, at that time, you were a conspiracy theorist if you said that. Well, by 2013, this was the mainstream opinion. None of those worked, the swine flu is still out there, no reliable vaccine for it, we just call it a summer cold now. Now, I don't know, and nobody knows, and those who claim they do are full of it, I don't know whether the Wuhan flu will follow the same trajectory. But the likelihood of that happening is pretty high. And the likelihood of the BCG vaccine to be a thing is pretty low. Still, if you end up documenting something that ends up not being compromat, it's still useful to have it because then you can dig up to see where did that person learn from? How did they know so early? And that's in itself an opportunity. So yeah, document everything. Don't pretend to know everything because very likely you don't. And of course, don't trust the mainstream media, but you know that already, you're smart people. However, just because you shouldn't trust the mainstream media, it doesn't mean you shouldn't follow it. Routinely, they publish compromat without them even knowing. And this has intensified during this particular panic. Also, if you have the opportunity, try to influence the mainstream media. Even I was surprised how easy it was to push some counter-narratives. Because ultimately, propaganda during a situation is a game of will and nerves of steel. Oftentimes, it doesn't even require a lot of money, but it requires a clear mind and nerves of steel. Especially in the early stages of the panic, when many NPCs run around like headless chicken. So, to sum up, the time for propaganda is now, not later. Better lose some nights now than try to repair the damage later. Politics always wins. The health issue is just a temporary layer. It will be gone. Other layers will come to replace it. Nothing changes fundamentally. What can change is how you approach things. And I can only hope that the non-left will be smarter on this time. Because in 2008 and 2009, we blew most of the opportunity. So yeah, that's really all I had to say. Tell me in the comments if you have other ideas. As always, I don't claim to know everything about everything. And of course, you can write to me with specific questions. Maybe I can help. With that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Send me to Sweden. Visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.